Hello, everyone, and welcome to Out of Character, the show where your favorite creators drop out of character for an hour to talk with game designer and host Marc Tassin, that'd be me, about their art, their process, and the nerdy stuff that inspires them. From the secrets behind their craft to the ins and outs of the business to the games, shows, and books that they can't get enough of, it's a unique and candid look at the people who create the stuff that you and I love. Now, as always, comments will be open throughout the show, and although I can't make promises, we'll do our best to pull in anything that you post there as we're going along and talking. Now, I know that some of you may have arrived here today excited to see Gwenda Bond. Unfortunately, Gwenda was not able to join us tonight. She was not feeling well and was really not up to doing this tonight. And I agree, it's tough when that sort of thing happens, but, that's life. We're all human. And the good news is, though, is that she actually had a backup ready to roll for us. And it's someone who's on my list that I've been wanting to talk to anyway. So now I want to just take a minute and introduce Christopher Rowe. Christopher, thanks for being on the show tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark. Happy All Saints Day from one saint namesake to another, although you spell it differently, and St. Christopher actually got kicked out during Vatican II.
Yeah, well, who's going to deal with all the details? We're good with just the basics of it. I'll just go with the Saints.
Exactly.
So, hey, tell everybody a little bit about yourself, about what you create, about what you've done.
Certainly. My name is Christopher Rowe. I'm in my 25th year of being a professional science fiction and fantasy author. My debut story was in the late lamented Realms of Fantasy magazine, which was a wonderful magazine edited by Shauna McCarthy in the late 90s, into the early 2000s, I believe. And my original work kind of foreshadowed all of my work. My first stories were set in rural Kentucky between the world wars, and my concerns with rural America and the fact that, as I always say, the future happens everywhere, have informed my work ever since. Mm-hmm. From that very first story all the way down to my most recent publication, a novella from Tor.com Publications called These Prisoning Hills, which is a novella set in eastern Kentucky after a great war. It's about the extractive industries that have invaded Appalachia for centuries. It's about trauma. It's about pain. And there's a giant robot.
Well, I mean, at that point, you've probably just lead with that and you're good. And then all the rest of it becomes extra cool. But no, that's awesome. In fact, I was looking at the description of it and it talked about post-apocalyptic Appalachian weird fiction, which I just think is a fantastic description. And immediately, I need to know more about it. I want to know more about it. Now, is this a one shot? Do you have more story that goes with this down the road?
It's a standalone. Yeah. So it can be read independent of any of my other work. But in, let's see here, what do the certificates say? In 2005, I was a nominee for the Nebula and the Hugo Awards for a story called The Voluntary State, which is about basically a war between Kentucky and Tennessee in a crazy cyberpunk nanotech informed future. And it was a novelette. I later wrote a short novel, very short novel called The Border State. Both of those appear in my collection, Telling the Map from Small Beer Press, along with 8 other stories that I've written through the years.
So it sounds like, I think that's what I love is when someone can take their background, take things that are near and dear to themselves and really embrace that in their writing rather than trying to just do the same thing everyone else. Like you said, the future is everywhere. I think I'm paraphrasing here, but I thought that was a very cool comment and a really good point that we tend to focus so much on a singular vision of where the future is and going and who lives in it that I think we end up, more and more people are exploring that idea, but I think that for a long time we were kind of locked into this one path.
I agree absolutely. And I'm not critical of that. Yeah. The young men mostly who created science fiction starting in the late 20s on down were mainly urban dwellers. They were mainly living in New York City, actually, with some exceptions like Ray Bradbury out in Los Angeles. And they wrote what they knew. They wrote what they suspected would be the future, which was that it would take place in polities in large urban areas. And the future does happen there. But the future also happens in Appalachia and in the Ozarks and in the rural areas of Northern California and the Pacific Northwest and in Central Africa and the Amazon basin. The future, I will again say this, happens everywhere. And people should not limit their imaginations, either as readers or writers or game players, to a certain fairly narrow demographic in terms of the world goes.
Yeah, I mean, that's really fascinating because, you've nailed it in that they were writing the future of the world they lived in. And as a result, people who came after them tried to emulate that and wrote about that same world and that same future in a lot of cases, as opposed to breaking free of that and going a different direction with it. And I think that's just really fantastic. In fact, I don't know if you've had a chance to watch the new Star Wars series Andor, but Andor, yeah, it's amazing because it takes you to places that aren't Coruscant, that aren't the big city. And I think Lucas already sort of did that with Luke, but it was more of a, the space opera part of it really came in more. But in Andor, you feel like you're living in a future that is out on the outskirts, that is where people are scraping by or where people have their own ancient traditions, that really what's happening half a galaxy away doesn't matter to them. And they have their own view of what the future is.
That sounds great. I'm going to go out of character, so to speak, for probably what most of the guests on this show have been, in telling you that it's probably been about 2 years since I watched much on television besides professional bicycle races. I'm not a television person, except for the weirdly deep streaming services that let you watch professional bicycle races, mainly out of Europe.
Well, you may not have gotten to see it, but it is actually a pretty fantastic show. Although
there's no reason I couldn't see it. What is it on Disney Plus?
Yeah, it's on Disney Plus, and it's just great. It's paced like I say this because I watch a lot of these. It's paced like a Nordic police procedural. It's got that sort of vibe and pacing, right? Like if you've ever watched those and watched Wallander and some of those shows where you just watch these guys and it's overcast and heavy and it sort of tears you. You're like pushing through it. I'm maybe not selling it very well, but if you're,
I'm aware of the genre, right? In terms of mystery novels. I did not know there was a tradition of television shows.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's got that vibe to it, right? And I think it's fantastic to see people exploring new ideas like this and taking it in new directions. So it's pretty cool.
Cool.
All right. So a couple of things I want to ask about. First, I want to talk to you a little bit about writing in general. Okay. We always try to talk about the business, the craft. I mean, how did you get started? Where did you start writing? When did you think I could probably try to do this?
I didn't start taking writing seriously until my mid-20s, and I become aware of the Clarion workshops, which are kind of boot camps for writers that go on to this day. In fact, I taught with my wife, Gwenda Bond. I taught at Clarion just this past summer. The impetus for my writing science fiction and fantasy was this. Throughout my youth and young adulthood as a reader, I constantly oscillated back and forth between being all in on genre, between reading all of the Tarzan books, all of the John Carter books, all of the Lancer, what were originally the Lancer Conans, although they were no longer Lancer by the time I read them. And then deciding that I was fancy and that as a Southerner and as a Kentuckian, I should be reading important Southern and Kentucky literature. I stand by that. I still read that. I still believe it is important. And I believe that William Faulkner absolutely deserved his Nobel Prize. But I would oscillate back and forth, and I could never decide. I never knew where to land as a reader and then eventually a writer. I felt like I had to choose. And then a book came out in the mid 90s called Bears Discover Fire and Other Stories by Terry Bisson, who is a Kentuckian. And I opened up that book and I read a few pages in the title story about elder care in the South, about family, the values that are and are not associated with family in Appalachia and the upper Cumberland Plateau, the upper South, as Terry calls it. And there are also bears in discovering fire. There are also it's set in the median of Interstate 65 between Smiths Grove and Bowling Green, Kentucky, a stretch of road I had driven many times, and it spoke to me so powerfully. It spoke to me with such intensity that I did not have to choose. I could be true to my heritage as both a Kentuckian of from a family that's been here for 200 years and as someone who is just absolutely immersed and a great lover of science fiction and fantasy in all its myriad forms. And so I decided, yeah, there you go. So I decided I could write something. And so I wrote a story. I was 25 maybe. And having written it, and it will never see the light of day, although I have extensively script mined it, I decided I wanted to be a professional science fiction and fantasy writer. So I started subscribing to Locus magazine, which I highly encourage anyone who's interested in science fiction and fantasy, whether as a reader or as a creator, and I read about the Clarions. The Clarions are these workshops that go back to the late 60s, early 70s. There's one in Seattle called Clarion West, and then there's just Clarion, which is now held on the campus of the University of California at San Diego. And I decided I'm going to go to this. It's 6 weeks long. I was luckily in a position with my employer and my then wife that I could take 6 weeks and go somewhere and develop this. For Clarion West, I had to write a second story. So the second story I ever wrote was my week 1 story at Clarion West. And I had to write a few more while I was there. And I decided I could do this. And it turns out that I could. Turns out that I have.
That's fantastic. And it's interesting because, this is the 24th episode of the show, and Clarion comes up again and again and again. And I think that not just Clarion, but opportunities like that seem to, in a sense, force you to really focus, force you to really do what you need to do. It seems to be so beneficial to people in getting that jump start you need.
Right. Now, at the same time, I should say, you, viewer, might not be somebody who would benefit from focus, that kind of intensity. You, viewer, might be a creator or a writer of some stripe who benefits from slow, broad, careful, or even not careful creation, because there's no one way to do it. That worked for me. It might not work for you. It might also work for you. It won't work for everyone. And you need to be very careful and very deliberate and study yourself and know what can work for you as a creator. You have to do it. You have to do the work, but you don't have to do it the way that anybody else has ever done it.
Yeah, and I think that's another thing that comes out is everyone's experience is so different getting into writing that it is true. It's important to remember that. And yeah, I'm glad you made that point, because although Clarion comes up, all those sorts of intense experiences come up, I know it's probably also when you're creating, it's also intensely emotional oftentimes. And you may not be in the head place to have someone put you in that experience, right? It may not be the thing that you need. And so that's a really good point to look at it. I guess the nice thing to know, though, is that there's all these different types of experiences out there, including more one shot where you're not putting a full 6 days in, but where you've got these opportunities, everything from Clarion to online classes that lots of different authors have, like Cat Rambo, to things like the Writer Symposium at Gen Con for folks who are, everyone on this watching this has probably been to Gen Con at some point. They do writing seminars there every single year. So there are opportunities like that all over the place.
That writing track at Gen Con, I haven't been since you were running it, but I don't know whether you ever noticed this or realized this, but you were selling to the individual events. And I don't know whether people know how Gen Con works, where you buy a ticket or you get a ticket somehow for each individual little programming item. And I believe you once told me that you were moving like 2,000 or more tickets for the writing workshop and the writing symposium and the writing panels and so on. That's bigger than any writing conference in the world. I mean, 2,000 impressions or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Just dwarfs writing specific. Now, it doesn't dwarf WorldCon or obviously Comic-Con or DragonCon or any of those, but those are not writing conferences. Those are science fiction conferences for fans and people selling stuff and people doing costuming and all that kind of stuff. As far as wanting to work writing, being interested in writing genre fiction, that was enormous. You know, that was one of the signal experiences of my life, was being on a panel and talking about how important the gray box of the Forgotten Realms was for me when I was a little kid. And then the two guys down the table just were like going, little kid, because they were two of the people who had worked on the gray box, you know, and that moved me in a way that almost nothing else has moved me in terms of public presentation and working with other writers goes. It was great.
Well, it was a lot of fun running that. And, you know, we did hit at our height. We had 2,500 unique guests each year visiting, and we were doing about 225 panels. Now, the folks who are running it today are veterans of the symposium, folks like Gregory Wilson, I'm completely like missing all of the names now.
Don't worry about it.
Aaron Rosenberg.
I would go to Gen Con every year. The last, COVID has been what COVID is. And also the fact that I've never been able to get into a hotel closer than 13 miles from the convention center. No matter, I'll be sitting there on the computer at 12 o'clock in 1 second, and I'm like hitting that button. It just never works out.
All felt that pain. Oh my God, we've all felt the pain of the. I always like. To me, it's like the beginning of one of the battles in Hunger Games, right? You're all sitting there, and there's this pile of weapons sitting in the cornucopia, and you're like, oh, "Okay, are you ready? Let's go any minute now," right? But I mean, the thing about it is that I do encourage people to check it out, because Aaron Rosenberg and Greg Wilson, the rest of those folks who are running it today, Karen Bovenmeyer, they're doing an amazing job. And I think folks should absolutely check it out. And it's a great opportunity.
And they always get amazing guest writers too.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. There were some great people there.
I'm not saying that because I was one, but I mean, the main literary guest at Gen Con is always top notch, always somebody really good.
Yep. Yeah, there's some great people who have been part of that. So I hope people will check it out, because it's a great way to sort of get that kick you need to really go out and do this. But at the same time, I think the advice that you just gave applies even to any sort of writing education, to the business. There is no one right way, right? No. Everyone has a very different experience, a very different path. So it's more about doing it than following the right steps to get there, right? Okay, so now I'm gonna have to ask you about the gray box. You brought up Forgotten Realms gray box. It sounds like that was one that you had on your shelf and, got a lot of use out of over the years.
Oh my, it wasn't just the gray box. It was the FR series. It was all of it, all through second edition. And then years later, when I came to write a Forgotten Realms novel, I went back and bought all the third edition and 3.5 stuff. I have, it's not on this bookshelf, but I don't know of a Forgotten Realms product that I have not read. I mean, I haven't read all the novels, but in terms of the gaming stuff, if there's a Forgotten Realms product that I have not owned and read, it would surprise me. It was my home country as a gamer for many years. Actually, not as a gamer so much, because I was never a dungeon master until just like the last 10 years or so. When I was a teenager and in my 20s, I was always just a player. But there are so many people who have had this experience. Reading the books, of a game that you never actually played, right? I mean, like Shadowrun was a big one for me.
Yeah.
BattleTech was a big one for me. These games that had these enormous universes with dozens upon dozens upon dozens of supplements, I would eat that stuff right up. I would just love immersing myself absolutely in these game worlds, and then maybe never even rolling a die in them. Now, I did get to play in the Forgotten Realms some because a friend of mine did run some in it, but I didn't actually play in the Forgotten Realms nearly as much as I did in Greyhawk, for example, or
Right, right.
Dragonlance.
So you said you've been running off and on over the last 10 years. What have you been running? What have you been playing?
The most sustained, longest period was when I was involved in organized play for the first edition of Pathfinder, which I completely skipped third edition and 3.5 in Dungeons and Dragons because of the circumstances of my life. And I played a fair amount of fourth edition, which had its merits and it had its merits. I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And then a friend of mine told me that the first edition Pathfinder core rulebook was the single best role-playing game book he had ever heard of, much less read. So, I plunked down my $59.99 or whatever it was for that enormous hardcover, and I agreed with him. I loved it. Now, I did not know when I read it and took it on board that it was essentially D&D 3.75. It was Jason Bueller's homebrew version. I mean, his house rules for D&D 3.5. But again, I loved the system. I loved playing it. I followed. I think I have all of the first edition Pathfinder rule books, but I also have all of the Galarian books. They set everything in their world of Galarian, which scratched that Forgotten Realms itch for me. They had dozens of maps, dozens of nations, hundreds of NPCs, and they managed it and integrated it in a way that is still distressingly rare. But the thing is, I kind of understand how people who want to play homebrew or people who don't even want to play homebrew who simply don't care, right? I understand the impulse to just pick up a module and say, let's go to keep on the Borderlands. And I'm like, Borderlands of where? And they're like, we don't know, we don't care, and that's fine. That's fun. And the game that I've been looking at a lot most recently is that way. Dungeon Crawl Classics. They're not building a world, although they are licensing a world. Fritz Leiber's Crawford and Greymouse are new on stories, and that's the reason I bought into that game, is because I love Fritz Leiber and I love the Crawford and Greymouse stories. So I found out that this role playing game existed. And so I went and ordered a bunch of stuff. And then once I started looking at it, I was like, maybe I should know what all this mechanical stuff that's at the end of all these paragraphs means. So I bought the core rule book too. And it's fun. It's a real throwback. I guess I don't pay a ton of attention to role-playing game news in society or anything like that. But I guess there's a throwback movement or an old school movement or something.
The old school movement, right?
Yeah, and I guess this is part of it, or maybe even a driving force behind that. I don't even know. And I really appreciate that. I appreciate the black and white line art. I appreciate the fact that there are no NPCs except the ones who will give you a mission and the ones you kill. And I mean, that's what we did when we were 12 years old, right? And there's I guess the first instance I read of it was in a David Hartwell anthology, and I believe somebody else may have said it first, but Hartwell said it the first time I read it, which is that the golden age of science fiction is 12. Instead of being like, some certain range of dates. And for me, the golden age of role-playing games was absolutely 12.
Right.
And so you're going to get me every time with, with yelling at me at 12 years old. Unless
Yeah.
you're a Marvel Cinematic Universe movie, in which case you're going to miss. But
Oh no.
I'll hold that unpopular opinion, and we'll set that back to the
All
side.
right. All right. I don't want to fight here. I don't want to fight. So, well, I think that's what's cool with the Dungeon Crawl Classics is that there is this ability to find that market where in the modern world of gaming and being able to sell over the internet. And the thing that I love hearing you talk about it is that too often I think that some of us who are really into this stuff end up getting so into the culture and the movements and the versions and the updates that we don't just see the game anymore, right? We see it within the context of all of this stuff. And to hear you describe this and go, yeah, I just thought it was awesome. And then later I discovered it was 3.75. I'm like going, see, that's fantastic. That's really at the end of the day, it's important for all of us to remember that just the joy of what we're doing, that's why we're doing it. That, yeah, we probably know way more than we should about the mechanics and everything that's going on underneath. But at the end of the day, it's like, what scratches that itch? What do we read through and just go like, that is super cool. I really like that. That inspires me.
Yeah.
You're talking a little bit about old school. And one of the things that, before we get to that, I was going to talk about a little about sword and sorcery, but before I get to sword and sorcery, there's something else that I want to ask you about before we get too far away from talking about your stuff. This is what always happens to me. We start talking about D&D and stuff, and I'm like, oh yeah, by the way, I've heard you've written some books. I want to ask you about these for a second, because one of the things that I love talking about with authors is when they break out of the mold of just like, yeah, I'm not just writing a short fiction for adults. I'm writing something completely different. Tell me about the Supernormal Sleuthing Service, which is the best name ever.
I will tell you about the Supernormal Sleuthing Service. I co-wrote 2 middle grade novels, fantasy mysteries with my wife, New York Times bestselling writer Gwenda Bond, when we were walking the dogs one day, and Gwenda loves 1930s movies, and she likes various aspects of them, and she'll talk about this and talk about that. And she was saying, why are there no more movies about hotel detectives? And I said, because there's no such thing anymore as a hotel detective. And so she was talking about hotel detectives, and we started talking about books about, or maybe writing a book about a hotel detective, one or the other of us, not writing together. And
now, before you go further, a hotel detective, probably half the people listening don't know what a hotel detective is.
Okay, it was very large hotels from the 1890s up through, I don't even know when it started. It's probably, it's actually possible that that Las Vegas casinos probably still have something similar to a hotel detective, although they're more like security heads or whatever. But the hotel detective was the guy in the movies, at least, who figured out who stole the jewelry from your room, or who killed the guy in room 346. And this is a legit thing. Large hotels used to employ people called hotel detectives. They were the heads of security. They were the people you checked your passport into when you were traveling abroad. But they were also, I'm told, responsible for essentially solving crime, fighting crime and solving mysteries. And if you read about the history of the golden age of hotels, they were part of it. And so Gwenda is fascinated with this, and she's talking about how to write a book about hotel detectives. And we came around to the idea of maybe writing a book about hotel detectives for kids. And it is a matter of dispute which one of us said this, because I believe it was me and she believes it was her. Somebody said it's the hotel where monsters stay when they visit New York. And
that's fantastic.
So we created the hotel in New York City where monsters stay when they visit town. And there's a gossipy dragon that lives in the basement and serves to heat the rooms, and serves to that's his tail up there on the top of that. And those are that's the New York Public Library, except that if you're a member of this, if you're in the part of the supernormal community, you know that the famous lions outside of the New York Public Library are actually living sphinxes, and only people with the proper magical skills can see and talk to them. 3 kids who are the children of the hotel detective, the chef, and the concierge and security head solve mysteries, and they interact with supernatural creatures from all over the world and from all mythologies from around the world, and they're just a ton of fun. They were from Green Willow, which is an imprint of HarperCollins.
Oh, that is awesome. Yeah, I wanted to ask this because I mean, just the concept and looking at them, I just had to know more about it. So it's very, very cool. And taking the hotel detective and bringing it into a kid's book in the modern world with monsters is awesome. Absolutely love it.
We loved it. We had a great time writing it. People always ask, what's it like living in a household with 2 writers? And it's wonderful. You've got a built-in accountability person. You've got a built-in first reader. And when we wrote those, Gwenda was still working a full-time job then. We're now both lucky enough to be full-time writers. But at that time, Gwenda was still working for the state government here in Kentucky in Frankfort. And the way we wrote those books was she would get up really early in the morning, like 4:30 or 5 o'clock, and write 1,000 words. And then I would get up and make her breakfast. And then she would go off to work, and I would read what she wrote, and I would write 1,000 words. And when she got home, she would read what I wrote, and we would talk about it. Next day, repeat. Next day, repeat, until you'd done that for 50 days. And then, of course, you rewrite, and then you revise, and then you turn it into the editor who sends you notes, and you revise again, and so on. But it was a very simple process for us. It was the simplest, easiest writing that I've done, probably, actually.
No, that's awesome. That is really cool. And so, that's one of the things that a lot of writers have is they have a writers group or they have a someone else who's reading, but it's like you've got that built in the next room from where you're at.
No, right there. I mean, our monitors back up to one another, actually.
Uh-huh. Oh, that's awesome. That's very cool. So let me ask you a couple other things about some of the writing that you've done. Now, one of the things you said that inspired you were the early sword and sorcery stuff and the pulp in general. It sounds like not just sword and sorcery, but the pulp stories in general. What was it about those that I guess not just was exciting to you then, but what about them sort of like inform your writing today? What do you take from those and think, that helps me to be a better writer now?
Well, I will tell you this. One thing that I find inspirational about the pulps, this came in the mail yesterday. This is the September 1965 issue of Fantastic Magazine, which is the first appearance of the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser novella Stardust.
Oh, wow.
And I will tell you this. One thing that inspires me is the smell, that wood pulp smell. Of old comics and old magazines. When you walk into a dealer's room at a science fiction convention, you go by one of those guys that has a bunch of pulp magazines. Oh, I mean, it predates my time. It's nostalgia for a time years before I lived, even.
Right.
But it evokes something in me, and I think of it as the raw wind of story. I mean, these were people that were writing from the id, and we were talking about early creators who lived in urban areas. An early creator who did not was Robert E. Howard of Cross Plains, Texas, who definitely wrote from the id. And, in 1929, he created what we know of as sword and sorcery movement, not with the Conan story, which came a little bit later. And there's a vitality. I'm going to use a word that is not often used with regard to fiction these days, but which Howard used. There's zest. There's energy. And what you have to do as a contemporary person of goodwill and who loves the world, what you have to do is take all of that, but set aside so many artifacts, so many problematic and painful artifacts of our history. Because Robert E. Howard, like many of his contemporaries, and like all of us, and like all of you, was an imperfect man. And he had some intensely problematic ideas and notions about race and gender. His correspondent and friend, H.P. Lovecraft, even more so. But there's stuff to learn there. There's stuff to be thrilled by and entertained by. What you have to do though, actually, I'm going to back up. It's not set it aside. It's to recognize it, and it's to
Mhm.
integrate it in your reading. Something that I see floating around the internet sometimes is all your faves are problematic, and
Mhm.
that is true even of people you're reading today. Somebody somebody is rightfully uncomfortable with your favorite story. Somebody is
Mhm.
rightfully uncomfortable with your favorite movie. You might not even be able to recognize it, and that's a shame. But I don't recognize it either, which is also a
Yeah.
shame. But you have to recognize that in the vast continuum that is human experience, imperfect creators are going to create imperfect works. So
Mm.
if you are going to engage with work, you must, as Arthur C. Clarke said, approach any work of art in order to appreciate it with love. Loving someone does not mean ignoring all of their bad qualities
Mhm.
and still love them.
Yeah, and I think that that's a challenging thing. And one of the things that you talked about that you taught me today was about a movement to sort of capture the positive elements of that. And just like we have the old school movement for role playing games, there seems to be a movement to capture the sword and sorcery essence without bringing along a lot of those more problematic issues, right? And
Right.
you're telling me about something called a New Edge Sword and Sorcery magazine,
Right.
which
New Edge Sword and Sorcery magazine came out. There's a place on the internet called the Whetstone Tavern Discord server. I only
Mhm.
recently became aware of it. Whetstone is an amateur. They take this word on proudly and put it on their cover. Whetstone is an amateur sword and sorcery magazine managed by a few people. One of them is an academic on the East Coast. His name and his affiliation are escaping me, but look up Whetstone. And anyway, the
Mhm.
Whetstone Tavern is a place where enthusiasts, writers, readers, artists involved with sword and sorcery, contemporary sword and sorcery. And I will reveal to you over the course of the next few minutes how much of it there actually is that you haven't heard of. So, back in the spring, I'm told, I wasn't there, a discussion got going about what could be said to be New Age sword and sorcery. Now, Howard Andrew Jones, who is a novelist who recently signed a 5-book deal with Bain Books to write a sword and sorcery series, uh,
Mhm.
and who edits this magazine, um, Tales from the Magician's Skull, put out by
Yeah.
Goodman Games, the same people who put out Dungeon Crawl Classics. He coined the term in the early aughts, I believe, and he described what it was and what he thought it was to him. Now, this got discussed and refined and apparently battled over. Um, in goodwill, in a sense of goodwill, by these creators on this Discord space. And what came out of it eventually was the idea that somebody should do an anthology. And the person who more or less got elected to um, do that anthology, Brackenberry, um, Oliver, I know him as Oliver, who is a guy who lives in Toronto and volunteers at the Bracket Collection, which is one of the great collections of science fiction and fantasy materials in the Western Hemisphere. He said, "No, I will not do an anthology, but I will do a magazine." So the magazine came about, New Edge. Now I'm going to read to you from Oliver's editorial. What is New Edge sword and sorcery? Now, this is a 2-page discussion about what is New Edge and sword and sorcery, but he helpfully provides a tweet-length paragraph, and I'm going to read it to you now. New Edge sword and sorcery takes the genre's virtues of its outsider protagonists, thrilling energy, wondrous weirdness, and a large body of classic tales, then alloys inclusivity, mutual creator support, a positive fan community, and enthusiastic promotion of new works into the mix. Now, there are a couple of things about that. First off, I love when anybody uses alloy as a verb. And
Yeah.
the most important thing is those two words, alloys inclusivity. All right. Alloy means bringing two things together. We live in this wondrous time in science fiction and fantasy. Maybe Elizabeth Bear said it's the rainbow age in science fiction and fantasy. There's so much good stuff from so many marginalized voices that it is now. I even outside Sword and Sorcery, I was counting today my subscriptions, not just the websites I look at, but the people I throw money at by subscribing to in terms of actual physical magazines, by being a Patreon supporter, by subscribing through waitlist books. 13. I subscribe to 13 science fiction and fantasy magazines. Now that does not mean I keep up with all of them, unfortunately. But it is a wondrous time to be alive as someone who is enthusiastic about science fiction and fantasy at short and long forms. Now, I write novels, but I am especially enthusiastic about the short form. I think the perfect form for science fiction is the novella. And although I have quibbles about this word, I think the perfect form for fantasy, especially Sword and Sorcery, is the novelette. Stories about 7,500 to 15,000 words long. And that work is being written now. My latest book is a science fiction novella. It's about 24,000 words long. Tor.com publications and other places are supporting that kind of work. They're supporting that length of work. People are responding to it with enthusiasm. And I don't know. It's just a great time to be alive in terms if you love science fiction and fantasy. Now is the best time since 1923 and Weird Tales started, in 1926 when Astounding started. Amazing, whichever one was the first one. This is the best time to be alive.
It's so fascinating because people spend so much time talking about how I miss the days of all these journals and magazines and all this. And I feel like it's all there and more than ever before. You just have to go out and find it. You just won't find them all lined up on a shelf.
Right. You're not. Okay. 1951. You are a 14-year-old person who likes exciting action adventure, science related, wizard related fiction. You have $1 in your pocket because you are wealthy, and you wander down to the newsstand, unless you live in the middle of nowhere like I grew up, in case there's no newsstand. But you wander down to the newsstand, and there are 24 lurid covers among hundreds of magazines, westerns, air stories, straight adventure, detective noir, and there are 20 or so magazines that are there to serve your love of science fiction and fantasy. I'm here to tell you, friends, that was a great time. There were problems in terms of representation that we were talking about, but if you were just this wildly enthusiastic kid, that was a great time. You could have bought 5 or 6 magazines with that $1 you had in your pocket and read glorious, glorious stuff. Well, I'm here to tell you, you still can. There are dozens of magazines, most of them online, many of them free, where you can read exciting new material. All you got to do is look for it, and you'll find it. It's easy. Google science fiction and fantasy magazines. You'll find a list somewhere, I'm sure. Maybe even one I put up sometimes.
Well, I mean, and I think the thing that's great about it is that those sorts of venues is where people are allowed. Like, one of the things that I just love about some of the older short fiction, science fiction, fantasy is how creative it was. They weren't following a formula. They weren't following rules. They were writing just crazy, like Jack Vance and these guys just going crazy, writing whatever came to them. And I feel like that happens more in some of these new publications than it does in some of the more mainstream things, where there's so much cost involved that they can't go too far. Not that there aren't a whole lot of great.
I agree with that. I largely agree with that. Now, I think that mainstream publishers like Orbit, like Simon & Schuster, like Tor, I think they do support experimental and new voices. And Zest for Adventure is supported by most publishers. Bang Books famously sells themselves on being adventure, the home of adventure and excitement. And But you're right. If you want a weird experience, even an experience you're not comfortable with, uh, go to swordsandsorceriesmagazine.com. You will find something that published this year that startles you. And a sense of startlement in reading genre fiction is something that if you came up in the 80s and 90s, you had at the beginning, not because the work was particularly startling, but because it was new to you,
Yeah.
but which you rapidly learned how to read. Okay. And it's good. That is a good thing. It is good to learn how to take on board things like a sense of abeyance, right?
Hmm.
Where you figure out the way mainstream readers never figure out that if you read something in the first 3 pages that doesn't really make any sense whatsoever in terms of narrative characterization or plot, because the way science fiction and fantasy works, that on page 11, by page 11, you'll understand it.
Hmm.
And that is a I would argue a better way to invoke sense of wonder than simply laying out a narrative in a fairly straightforward fashion.
And
Go ahead.
no, I'm just saying that I can't stop smiling because it's like the most positive, and when you say it, it's so obvious when you say it that there's so much amazing, wonderful, energizing, creative, powerful stuff out there right now that
Mhm.
it's I think that we are instead of being in sort of like a point of, oh gosh, it's not like it used to be, it's like, no, it's better, it's in
Right,
every
right.
way it's better than it ever was.
That's the best way I've heard it said. No, it is not like it used to be. It is not like it used to be in so many wonderful and fantastic and just joyous ways.
Yeah.
I mean, I take joy in the fact that I subscribe to Faya magazine, which is devoted exclusively to creators from the African diaspora. I mean, because
Hmm.
I read things in that magazine that I have never read about or thought about in my life, and they make me a better reader. They make me, at their best, they make me a better person for taking that
Hmm.
stuff on board, which is what good fiction has always done from, from Homer on down.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we go into wrapping things up, I just want to take a second to say, oh, Brackenbury is saying hello to you from the things. Trader Man here is voicing that Whetstone and New Edge are fantastic. And so is Hemvar, a whole group of people here hanging out, absolutely like cheering for everything that you're saying. So, really nice to hear that from folks and hear people talking about all of this. So, now, along the lines of New Age, we already talked a little bit about New Edge Sword and Sorcery magazine, which, people should definitely check out and take a look at. You also talked about an author, and I believe her name was Cora Bullard. Is that
Bullard,
pronounced?
Cora Bullard.
Bullard.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah.
she's in New Edge. She's in this magazine, but she actually just won a Hugo Award. She won the
Oh,
Hugo
fantastic.
Award for yeah, there you go. For best fan writer. But beyond being a fan writer, she studied English in Bremen, I believe, in Germany. She lives in Germany,
Hmm.
and she writes all kinds of stuff from space opera to I don't know what Southern Monsters is, and I'm afraid I'm embarrassed to say I'm not familiar with that
She's
particular
she's
title.
written a
I
lot of
came to her,
amazing stuff, so you
I
can't
came
have
to
read
her
it
through
all yet.
Sword and
Yeah.
Sorcery, and that is what I've read by her. She is a delightful writer. She's very skilled, and my favorite thing about her work is I hesitate to say too much about this because I don't want to spoil it for anybody. She has a metafictional conceit to
Hmm.
her to much of her work, her mysteries and sword and sorcery work that that are involved with the collaboration that she's involved in. That is all I will say about it. But she has. I just started reading one of her sword and sorcery characters. That's an interesting thing to point out, by the way. Cora has two main sword and sorcery heroes, or one of them's a pair of heroes. And going back to Robert E. Howard, going back to Farfar and the Grey Mouse, or going back to Elric, all these guys, and now women, and now people, non-binary people, are writing that write sword and sorcery, one of the interesting things about it is it supports the series character in a way that no other genre, except perhaps mystery, ever has and does. And you can onboard yourself usually with any of these characters at any point in their careers. And Howard especially wrote completely out of order. They didn't write the origin story. The Conan's first story that appeared in Weird Tales, The Phoenix on the Sword, actually takes place chronologically almost last in the 18 or 20 odd stories that appeared in Howard's lifetime. And Cora is particularly good at writing a consistent and energetic set of stories that reward being read in order, but also reward being not read in order. If you go to her website or go look for her on drivethroughfiction.com or any other venue where you buy fiction, she is a self-published writer. Mostly not. I mean, she had a story in New Edge, and I think she's had stories in a couple anthologies, and she sells her stories as one-offs, as individual short stories, which is great because you can put them on your ridiculously gigantic tablet, and then just you're making lunch or whatever, and you've got 10, 15, 20 minutes, and you can kind of go in, get in there, read, get to the beginning, get to the middle, get to the end, get thrilled. And I think it's a great format. I think short fiction, we've been talking about it all evening, but short fiction is just my jam, man.
Yeah, it's awesome. Well, as always happens, we've run out of time. We could talk more and more about all of this stuff. It's awesome stuff. For everyone who watched our show, that was our boost for the night. Cora, go ahead and check out her stuff. You definitely want to. That's your homework assignment for the next week. And Christopher, thank you so much for stepping in last minute to join us. This has been fabulous. I've been wanting to talk to you anyway, so it's great that this opportunity came up. So it's really nice to get to talk to you.
You too.
All right. Take care. Well, everyone, that's the end of our show. You have gotten to spend another hour listening to us talk about all sorts of nerdy things, science fiction, role-playing games, you name it. We've dug into it. I'm going to be off next week, but the week after, I'll be back with Alina Pete, an amazing illustrator and writer. You're definitely going to want to join us for that. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, and we will see you again soon.